I think it's important to go back to the point that David Rieff made of understanding. Even he, of course, supported rejecting the motion because it's so strong and ambiguous as to what it even means. If we think about what aid actually achieves and what it doesn't achieve, we have to make sure we avoid the spurious correlations that have been mentioned tonight. Just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean one is responsible, of course, for the other. But we also have to think about the framing of this statement, which is about the present tense, not the past. We're not here to discuss and debate President Mobutu tonight. We're here to talk about whether aid is doing more harm than good. And on that, there are 4 basic points I think we need to keep in mind. The first is that it's often understood or misunderstood that bad governments and corruption are responsible for Africa's poverty, and singularly responsible. Professor Ayittey often refers to the cheetahs of the new generation and the hippos of the last generation. Well, what about the cheetahs of the new development generation, the cheetahs of the new aid generation that are producing remarkable results across the board? When we actually look at the statistical evidence, as Professor Easterly does and I do and others, we see that even when we compare governments with equal levels of good governance, we see that Africa on average grows about 2% per year slower than other developing countries around the world. Why is that? Why is it that countries like Ghana and Senegal have better Transparency International ratings than China and India, while it still grows so slowly while China and India take off? Why is it that Vietnam grows so quickly while it has governance ratings so far below Tanzania or Burkina Faso? It's because of the issues of disease, it's the lack of infrastructure, it's the lack of education, it's a terrible legacy of colonialism, but it's about much, much more than bad governments. There's no question that a bad government can drive a country off a cliff, but aid is about tackling those very practical challenges of health, education, and infrastructure if it's to be done properly. Now, Professor Easterly discussed the $600 billion of aid to Africa. That's the second myth, is that this is vast sums down the drain. How much is $600 billion if we think about it per African per year? If you divide that over all the years, over all the Africans, by my estimate, it's maybe $28 per African per year. That's all the money going down the drain. And then there's the third issue. Well, what do we get for it? We've heard that nothing has been achieved. Well, let's talk about some of those successes. There's the smallpox eradication that happened around the world, of course, thanks to, I have to say, the UN's World Health Organization that set the target, set up a smallpox eradication unit, and got rid of the disease. There's the fight against AIDS. In 2002, we had perhaps 50,000 people on antiretroviral treatment in Africa. Thanks to the creation of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, and the US President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, we now have well over 1 million people on antiretroviral treatment within just 5 years. And for those of us who were in the trenches 5-7 years ago, this was considered impossible. Impossible. We have throughout Africa primary enrollment rates since 1991 alone up 20 percentage points. Just last week, we had the news that UNICEF, the Red Cross, and others had cut measles death in Africa by 91% between 2000 and 2006, from nearly 400,000 people a year, children, to 40,000 a year. They actually set a target to do that by 2010, and they were 4 years ahead of schedule. Of the 20,000 deaths a day that our moderator pointed out at the beginning, those 360,000 are 1,000 a day off the total. That was aid backing it. That was UNICEF, that was WHO, that was the American Red Cross, that was the Centers for Disease Control working with governments and the government national plans, and they got the job done. In Malawi, many of you might have seen the New York Times front page story on the weekend, where aid supported the national government to implement the plan that it wanted to implement to get fertilizer and seeds to farmers. And in just 2 years, we saw a full country, one of the poorest countries on the planet, with a better governance rating than many countries growing much faster than it, double its food production from 1 ton per hectare to 2 tons per hectare, and it's now actually an aid donor in the region. So we have to reject these myths, we also need to reject the one about trade, the fourth one, that it's trade, not aid. We all want trade, we all want aid, and we all want market development, and we want to focus on the practical things that can be done to reduce poverty and to support the countries to reduce poverty on their own terms. So let me just conclude by saying, first, just screaming governance and corruption is simply not the case. It's too simplistic and it obscures the underlying truth of disease, lack of infrastructure, lack of education in Africa. Second, the scary big numbers that we often hear are actually quite tiny, in fact, minuscule when we think of them in terms of the real people in Africa and what they're trying to achieve. Third, we see amazing successes each and every day, such as the eradication of measles, when practical strategies are set to achieve practical targets, no politics, just getting the job done. So it's with these 3 points in mind that I urge the House to reject the simplistic and misleading proposition that aid to Africa does more harm than good, and more importantly, let's join together to focus on the practical task of ensuring that aid builds on the successes to keep doing as much good as it possibly can. Thank you.